The wind never truly stops on Culloden Moor. It sighs through the heather, a low, constant whisper that carries the chill of the North Sea. Even on a bright afternoon, there's a dampness in the air that seeps into your bones, a quiet that feels less like peace and more like a held breath. This is a place where history didn't just happen, it soaked into the soil. And if you stand here alone, as the light begins to fade and the shadows stretch long across the boggy ground, you might just understand why. For over 270 years, people have sworn this land is still haunted, not by a single ghost or even a handful, but by an entire army. Our story doesn't begin with a ghost sighting. It begins with a bet. A group of friends, fortified by more than a little whiskey and the boldness of a summer's evening in 1749, 3 years after the battle that shattered a nation. They were locals, from Inverness perhaps, or the nearby villages, men who had lived through the aftermath, who had seen the redcoats patrol the roads and heard the whispered stories of the wounded hunted through the hills. The moor, to them, was a place of profound sadness, and on this night, on a dare, one young man agreed to spend the hours of darkness alone there, by the great stone marker known as the Well of the Dead, to prove his courage, to prove the stories were just that, stories. He took a blanket, a flask, and a pistol for comfort. As his friends rode back toward the warmth and light of town, their laughter fading into the gloom, the utter silence of the moor descended. It was a silence that had weight. He built a small fire, its crackle the only defiance against the vast, dark emptiness. The hours ticked by, marked only by the slow sinking of his fire. He fought sleep, jumping at every rustle in the heather, every call of a distant bird. Then, near midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. His fire guttered, and the first sound came not from the heather, but from the earth itself. A deep, resonant thrum, like a giant drum being struck far below the peat. Then, another, and another. A slow, grim, marching beat. He scrambled to his feet, pistol cold in his hand. The sound was no longer beneath him, but around him. It was the unmistakable, disciplined cadence of marching feet on hard ground, but there was no one there. The moon broke from behind a cloud, bathing the moor in a sickly silver light. And then, he saw them. Shapes, faint at first like mist rising from the bog, coalescing into the forms of men. Hundreds of them. They wore tartan plaids, some trailing, some clutched around shoulders. Their faces were gaunt, smeared with dirt and exhaustion. They carried muskets, targes, the round Highland shields, and the long, broad blades of claymores. They marched in a silent, grim column, their footfalls making that terrible, hollow drumming sound. He could see through them, to the dark heather beyond. Yet their presence was overwhelming, a tide of spectral sorrow moving past his frozen form. He caught the eye of one, a young man, no older than himself, whose phantom gaze held a depth of despair that struck him like a physical blow. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound ceased. The figures shimmered, fragmented like smoke in the wind, and were gone. The man didn't wait for dawn. He ran, stumbling through the darkness, all the way to his friend's door, where he collapsed, babbling of the dead army on the moor. This was one of the first recorded accounts, but it would not be the last. For generations, the people of the Highlands have passed down stories of the Fear Chlees, the merry dancers, the northern lights, but also of a darker, more terrestrial phenomenon. Larach Chuil Lodair, the spectral host of Culloden. These are not casual ghost stories told for thrill. They are the echoes of a national trauma, a cultural wound so deep it seems to have scarred the very fabric of reality. To understand the ghost, we must first understand the death. The 16th of April 1746. The final pitched battle on British soil. On one side, the Jacobite army of Charles Edward, Stuart, Bonnie, Prince Charlie, a mix of Highland clansmen Lowland Scots, and some French and Irish troops. They were hungry, exhausted, and bitterly divided after a failed night march meant to surprise the government forces. On the other, the Duke of Cumberland's professional army, well-fed, well-rested, and armed with discipline and artillery. The moor was a boggy, treacherous piece of ground, chosen poorly for the Highland charge. As the clans lined up, the wind drove a sleety rain sideways into their faces. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Cumberland's artillery cut swathes through the packed Highland lines. When they finally charged, the momentum broke on the steady musketry and bayonets of the government troops. The famed Highland charge, which had broken lines at Prestonpans and Falkirk, faltered and died here, in the mud and the blood. But the battle was just the beginning of the horror. What followed was the slaughter. Government troops were given orders to show no quarter to the rebels. Wounded Highlanders were dragged from hiding places in the ditches and shot or bayoneted. Local lads, come to watch the fight from a distance, were hunted down and killed. The moor became an abattoir. By the end, in under an hour, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 Jacobites lay dead, compared to only about 300 government troops. Their bodies were stripped, plundered, and tossed into mass graves, the great pits still visible today as long, green mounds. The clans were forbidden to reclaim their dead for proper burial. They were left in anonymous heaps, their spirits, in the Gaelic worldview, untethered and unrestful. And then came the real terror: the pacification of the Highlands. Cumberland's troops, nicknamed Butcher for his actions, embarked on a systematic campaign of destruction. Homes were burned, livestock slaughtered, and crops destroyed. Men, women, and children were hunted, shot, or imprisoned. The wearing of tartan and the carrying of arms were banned under penalty of death or transportation. The Gaelic language and culture were suppressed. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was an attempt at cultural extermination. The soul of the Highlands was ripped out on Culloden Moor, and the survivors were left with a grief so vast it had no outlet. This is the fertile ground from which the legend of the Phantom Regiment grew. The first sightings weren't of battle reenactments, but of silent, marching columns, the ghosts of the Jacobite army on the move, perhaps eternally retreating from their doom, or eternally arriving too late. A farmer taking a shortcut across the moor at dusk in the 1,780 seconds reported seeing a line of ragged, sorrowful men materialize from the evening mist, trudge silently past him, and vanish into the wall of a tow-bear, a springs that was known to be a site of a mass grave. He claimed the air grew bitterly cold, and the smell of damp earth and peat smoke filled his nostrils, a scent associated with the clan encampments. Another account from the early 1800s comes from a mail coach driver on the old road that skirted the moor. His horses, normally steady, suddenly reared in terror, snorting and straining at their traces. As he fought for control, he saw ahead, blocking the road, a company of spectral Highlanders. They were not transparent, he said, but solid-looking, though lit by a faint, internal phosphorescence. He saw the details: the checkered pattern of a MacDonald tartan, the glint of a brass pistol butt, the desperate, determined set of a man's jaw. They stood for a moment, as if guarding the pass, then simply dissolved into the night air. The horses bolted and didn't stop for a mile. But the most common and most chilling reports are auditory. The phantom drums, the sound of marching feet on hard ground where there is only soft peat, the clash of steel, the muffled report of muskets, and most hauntingly, the screams and Gaelic curses of dying men. These sounds are often reported on the anniversary of the battle or during stormy weather, when the wind seems to carry voices. In 1859, a renowned folklorist collecting stories in the area interviewed an elderly shepherd who swore that every year on the night of April 16th, he would retreat from his cottage on the edge of the moor because the sounds became unbearable. "It is not a thing you hear with your ears alone," the shepherd said. "You feel it in your chest, the thunder of the guns, the crying. It is the moor itself, remembering." The phenomenon wasn't confined to the battlefield. The trauma of Culloden rippled outwards, and so did the ghosts. There are stories of phantom pipers playing a lament on the shores of Loch Ness, of spectral wounded men appearing at the doors of remote crofts begging for water, only to vanish when it is brought. These stories served a purpose. In a culture where oral history was paramount, they were a forbidden, subversive way of keeping memory alive. To speak of the Jacobite cause was treason, but to speak of a ghost? That was just folklore, a way to honor the dead without inviting the attention of the authorities. Every story of the Phantom Regiment was a silent act of remembrance, a defiance against enforced forgetting. The sightings evolved with time. In the late 19th century, as Romanticism and Victorian spiritualism took hold, the reports took on a new character. Visitors from Edinburgh and London, armed with curiosity and sometimes with early cameras, came to the moor, hoping for a glimpse. Some reported seeing not just the soldiers, but the battle itself, playing out like a spectral theater. The lines forming, the cannon firing, the charge, the rout. These accounts are often more detailed, but also more influenced by the popular imagery of the time. Yet, the core of raw terror remained. A woman on one such excursion in 1892 wrote in her diary of fleeing the moor after seeing a tall, fair-haired officer on a gray horse materialize before her. "He looked at me with such profound sadness," she wrote, "that I felt I was intruding on a private, eternal grief. I shall not go back." What are we to make of these stories? The rational explanations are many. The moor is a place of strange acoustics. Wind through the gullies and over the stones can sound like voices, moans, even drums. The low light and swirling mist, the hair that rolls in from the sea, can play tricks on the eyes, forming shapes out of shadow and heather. The power of suggestion is immense. Knowing you're standing on a mass grave primes the mind for terror. And the grief, the collective, cultural grief, is a tangible force. It's a landscape of memory, where every stone and hollow whispers of loss. But for those who have experienced it, rationalism provides little comfort. Modern-day visitors, park rangers, and even skeptical historians have reported unexplained phenomena. Camera batteries draining instantly, feelings of being watched or followed by an unseen presence, sudden drops in temperature in specific spots, and yes, on rare, still evenings, the sound of distant, rhythmic tapping, like drumsticks on a taut skin. The modern caretakers of Culloden Moor, now under the care of the National Trust for Scotland, tread a careful line. They are stewards of both a historical battlefield and a vast, unmarked cemetery. They present the facts, the troop movements, the tactics, the political context. But they also, quietly, acknowledge the stories. Many of the guides have their own experiences to share, not as advertised ghost tours, but as whispered anecdotes after hours. One long-serving ranger speaks of locking up the old Leonac cottage, the only surviving building from the time of the battle, and feeling an overwhelming, oppressive sadness descend upon him the moment the door closed, a weight that lifted only when he stepped back outside into the twilight. Another tells of always feeling a peculiar resistance when walking near the mass grave of the Clan MacDonalds, as if the very air was thicker there, charged with a silent protest. It is at these graves, the simple, solemn stones marking the clan burial pits, that the emotional heart of the haunting lies. Visitors leave tokens here. Coins, flowers, sprigs of heather, small bottles of whiskey. But sometimes, they leave notes. Handwritten messages in Gaelic and English, tucked under stones or tied to the nearby fence. Letters to long-dead ancestors, apologies for the forgetting. Expressions of a grief that has been passed down through generations like a genetic memory. This act of communion suggests that the Phantom Regiment is not merely a ghost story, but an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present. The ghosts, if they are there, are not just replaying a battle. They are waiting to be acknowledged. The most profound encounters are often the simplest and the least dramatic. A tourist from Canada, a descendant of Highlanders who fled after the collapse of the Jacobite cause, once described standing by the Well of the Dead as the sun set. She wasn't looking for ghosts. She was just listening. And in the stillness, she said she didn't hear drums or screams. She felt a profound, collective sigh, a release of breath held for centuries. It wasn't frightening. It was heartbreaking. It was the sound, she believed, of being remembered. This gets to the core of the Phantom Regiment's enduring power. In Gaelic tradition, the line between the living and the dead was always porous. The dead were not gone. They were an Itheam, the other people, existing in a parallel world, sometimes glimpsed at liminal times, dawn, dusk, the turning of the seasons. A sudden silence in a conversation was said to mean a ghost had entered the room. Proper remembrance, through story and song, was a duty to keep them at peace. Culloden represented a catastrophic rupture in this cycle. So many dead, so suddenly, denied their rights, their names erased, their culture outlawed. The Phantom Regiment, then, can be seen as a cultural symptom. A psyche, both individual and collective, attempting to process an unprocessable trauma by externalizing it. The land itself, soaked in blood and sorrow, became a psychic recorder, replaying the moment of shock on a loop. But what of the soldiers themselves? Not the ghosts, but the real, flesh and blood men who fell here. Let us pull back the veil of legend for a moment and meet just one. Donald McGillivray of Dunlickety, a member of the Clan Chattan Confederation. We know from scant records that he was a farmer, a man of the land, likely in his 30s. He would have answered the call of his chief, taken up the sword that had hung over his hearth, and marched off for a cause he may only have partially understood. Driven by loyalty and the promise of a better future. We can imagine him on the morning of the battle, cold, hungry, staring across the moor at the lines of red. The fear, the adrenaline, the desperate hope. Then the cannon roar, the charge, the stumble in the bog, the searing pain, and then nothing. His body was likely stripped of his plaid and anything of value, dragged or rolled into a pit with dozens of others, and covered with quicklime and soil. His family, back in Dunlickety, would have waited for news that never came. They would have lived in fear of the redcoats, unable to publicly mourn, forced to whisper his name. His spirit, in their belief, was untethered, wandering. Is it Donald McGillivray that the mail coach driver saw? Is it his face that appears, gaunt and sorrowful, in the mist? We cannot know. But this personalization is crucial. The Phantom Regiment is not a faceless horde. It is a compilation of individual tragedies, of thousands of Donald McGillivrays, each with a name, a home, a story cut brutally short. The haunting is the echo of all those silenced stories demanding to be heard. The 20th and 21st centuries have not silenced the phenomena. If anything, as the moor has been preserved and visitor access increased, the reports have become more frequent, though often filtered through a modern lens. People talk of orbs in photographs and EVP recordings, electronic voice phenomena that claim to capture Gaelic whispers. Skeptics rightly point out the power of suggestion and the proliferation of sensitive digital equipment prone to pareidolia, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in random noise. Yet, some recent accounts defy easy explanation. A couple visiting from England in 2015, with no prior knowledge of the battle's details, reported a shared hallucination so vivid they sought historical verification afterward. They claimed that while walking near the field of the English, where government troops were buried, they suddenly smelled an overpowering, acrid scent of gunpowder and a sweeter, coppery smell they later realized was blood. The air grew thick and still, and for a few seconds, they heard what sounded like men groaning and the rustle of coarse fabric. The experience passed as quickly as it came, leaving them shaken. They were later shown a period map that indicated the very spot they were standing was where a key artillery battery had been positioned, and where hand-to-hand fighting had been particularly fierce. A former soldier, a veteran of modern conflicts, visited Culloden on a quiet, drizzly weekday. He walked the field alone, not as a tourist, but as a fellow combatant, trying to understand. He later wrote that he didn't see or hear anything supernatural. Instead, he felt a deep, professional empathy. Standing at the Jacobite line, looking across the boggy ground they had to charge, he felt a chill that was tactical, not spectral. They never stood a chance, he said. It was a killing ground. You can feel it. The dread those men must have felt. It's still here. It's in the geometry of the place. For him, the haunting wasn't about ghosts. It was about the permanent imprint of tactical despair upon a landscape. So, what truly haunts Culloden Moor? Is it the spirits of the dead, trapped in their final, traumatic moments, replaying them for eternity in a kind of purgatorial loop? Is it the land itself? A slate of peat and stone that absorbed the violence and occasionally reverberates with the memory, like a struck bell? Or is it us, the living, projecting our own grief, our fascination with tragedy, and our longing for connection onto a place that serves as the perfect, somber canvas? The answer is likely all three, intertwined like the roots of the heather. The historical reality of the massacre provides the seed. The fertile ground of Gaelic folklore and profound cultural trauma provides the medium. And our own human need to memorialize, to understand, and to feel a shiver of connection with the past provides the spark that brings the story to life, again and again. The final witness to call is not a tourist or a folklorist, but the moor itself. Stand there at dusk. Look across the sweeping, barren expanse. The wind speaks a language older than Gaelic. The rain feels like cold tears. The silence is not empty. It is full. It is the silence of 1,500 voices that were suddenly silenced. It is the silence of a culture holding its breath. It is the silence before the phantom drums begin. Perhaps the Phantom Regiment is not something you see or hear with your everyday senses. Perhaps it is something you feel in the sudden hush that falls over a group of chattering visitors when they step onto the field. It's in the way your eyes are drawn to the stark, beautiful loneliness of the place. It's in the palpable shift from a historical site to a sacred, sorrowful space. You leave Culloden Moor changed. You carry a piece of its silence with you, and in that silence, if you listen closely to your own heart, you might just hear the faintest echo of a drum, or the sigh of a man who has lain in the cold ground for nearly 300 years, finally feeling that someone, at last, has come to bear witness. The story of the Phantom Regiment is not a story with an ending. It is an ongoing lament. It is the ghost of a world that was destroyed, forever marching across the twilight border between history and memory, between earth and spirit, between forgetting and remembrance. And as long as the wind sighs over the heather and the shadows lie long on the graves, the ghosts of the Highland dead will continue their silent, solemn vigil. They are waiting for us to remember. And in telling their story, we ensure that they and the world they died for never truly fade away.